Logic, magician. That was somber because we're so serious.
There we go. Yep. Hi, everyone. We're the Logic Magicians. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Zach.
Yep. So today we're going to be continuing our series on logical fallacies. And we'll actually be starting off with the first few subcategories of fallacy of relevance. If you didn't see the previous video, we kind of give an outline of logical fallacies and the broad and subcategories. We'll put a link in the description below. But today we're going to be talking about a specific broad category, and within that, two of these subcategories that we have. So today we're going to be talking about fallacies of relevance. And to kind of refresh you, fallacies of relevance are essentially arguments, they're cliche arguments that bring up something that is irrelevant to this core of logic in the argument. We've talked about fallacies of relevance. I encourage people to think of logic as kind of this core, this kernel at the center of everything, and nothing but the argument matters as far as logic is concerned. As we know practically in our lives, especially as communications majors, graduates, people, that obviously those things do matter. Things outside of logic do come into play, but we're going to be focusing on the logic for now. So that's essentially what fallacies of relevance are. It's bringing up something that is irrelevant to that core of logic. We'll be talking about two subcategories today. We're going to be talking about ad fontem arguments, and we're going to be talking about red herring arguments. We're going to start off with ad fontem. So ad fontem arguments, that's a Latin term. F-O-N-T-E-M. Ad, well, ad means of, that's A-D, and fontem, yeah. F-O-N-T-E-M. It's a Latin term for, remember what it is, Zach?
Yeah, of the fountain.
Very good.
Which is a water source, and you attack the source.
Exactly. Yeah. So you know, that's the kind of mnemonic device I give people. Ad fontem means of the fountain. Fountains are water sources, and basically an ad fontem argument or an ad fontem attack, as it most often is attacking the source of the information, where the argument or the information is coming from. And as we've said, the argument itself is not determined by the person giving it. So for example, if there was someone else on this video giving the exact same information, let's say it's someone you dislike, right? Imagine someone you dislike. Now look at me. Now imagine someone you dislike. Now look back to me. Then imagine them giving the exact same information that I'm giving, and that wouldn't affect the actual content, right? Now, would it affect your reception of the content? Probably, right? But it doesn't actually affect the quality of the information being given. So let's talk about, so we're going to be talking about four different specific ad fontem fallacies. Four specific ones. Yep, and there's many more. There's many more. I think we mentioned previously there's a guy who has collected hundreds of logical fallacies on his website. I'll post a link in the description to that as well. It's a great resource for looking up stuff because there's tons. So the first we're going to be talking about is what's called an ad hominem abusive, or an abusive ad hominem. Ad hominem. And this is when you are attacking the character of the speaker. So those of you
say that.
Exactly. No, those of you who don't know me personally, it doesn't always come across in a video. I'm a very tall individual. I'm 6'8". So an example of this would be if Zach and I got into an argument and I said, well, Zach, you're short, which you're not. You're just short compared to 6'8", which most people are. But if I said, like, Zach, you're short, so you don't know what you're talking about,
I would reply with, well, you're tall and your heart has to work a lot harder to get blood to your brain. So
Exactly. So those are great examples of ad hominem attacks. Now, again, like the examples, I try to pick something that's like fairly innocuous, something that's not really going to hurt people's feelings. Zach, I am not aware of you being, insecure about height. Um, I'm
You am
not.
I?
So, obviously that's fair game for us. But oftentimes these will manifest themselves a lot worse. So you'll see politicians call other politicians liars. That's attacking the character. Whether or not a person has in the past lied or they lie frequently actually has no logical bearing on whether or not their current argument or their current idea is any good. Again, it's certainly, absolutely, and justifiably going to affect how receptive you are to that. Right? But as far as the logic is concerned, it doesn't matter if someone lies regularly on any particular argument. So let's say I am a known hoodwinker, and I
Fun.
lie all the time. Right? The fact that I say, it's 95 degrees outside, which right now it's not actually, but earlier today it was. But if I say it's 95 degrees outside, the fact that I'm a liar doesn't change whether or not that's true. Right? You can go outside, you can measure the temperature, and you're like, oh, hey, Jonathan happened to tell the truth. And so a
Yeah, it's
lot,
actually that
yeah, go
that
ahead.
me as a magician I worry about, and I don't know if it's justifiable or not, but um, you know, magicians don't have the greatest reputation for truth telling because the core of it is deception, and
Yeah.
I worry about the reputation that could could bring.
Well, for logical people, it shouldn't matter.
Yay, logical people!
Which, as we know, most of the population is.
98.6%
That's
of
a
all
different
people.
fallacy, Zach.
Oh, dang it!
We'll get there in the next couple of videos. But yeah, so obviously this is one that we're pretty familiar with, right? We see it on the playground from a very young age. This is rampant in political discourse. This is something we encounter, if not on a daily basis, quite regularly. And I'll say this for ad hominem arguments, and this will apply to actually all ad fontem arguments. In this series, we're going to talk a little bit about how to avoid these fallacies, some strategies for what to do if you encounter them. For all ad fontem arguments, so are the ones that we're going to be covering partially, or the one part of the ones we're going to be covering today. Just don't do them. Don't commit them. Don't attack people's character. There'll be some other fallacies where there's some strategies where you can still you have to maybe gather some more data, but you can kind of turn it around. Ad fontem arguments, you just don't do it. It's that simple. Don't attack a person's character. That doesn't make for a good discourse. And as far as how to deal with it when you get into an argument and let's say someone is attacking your character, this is one of those things where at that point that person is pretty clearly not willing to engage in an honest discourse. They're not interested in discourse. They're not interested in having a conversation, and there's really no point to that conversation. So I said that I'll kind of talk about my personal criteria for getting into discussions, especially online, since we're kind of living in the digital age. Once it devolves to name calling, um, there's really no point in engaging.
So what if somebody starts with name calling? Can
Just
you
don't.
engage? No,
I mean, you can't. So obviously, this isn't like I'm gonna find you and you know.
destroy you.
Well, no, definitely not. But like, I'm not gonna find you and like scold you if you do it. That's completely your personal choice. I would say if someone starts off with name calling, it's not worth engaging.
Okay.
Clearly, they're in an elevated state and an elevated emotional state, and like we've talked about, that's not conducive to critical thinking.
I am going to try and find all of the instances, any instance where it's okay to attack a character. I can't think of any right now, but we'll see.
I mean,
'Cause This ain't over
Hitler's a
yet.
pretty safe
He was a
target.
great artist and a great rhetorician.
But again,
It's a bad thing to say. So, fun story about Hitler. In my senior year art class, we had to do a portrait of somebody, and I'm not a great artist person, and so I decided to do my portrait of Hitler because if I messed up, nobody would care if I messed up a picture of Hitler, and it actually turned out really good. And I gave it to the history teacher because I didn't want to keep a picture of Hitler. So
that's probably good. What a story. Yeah. So again, generally speaking, don't attack people's character. It does not make for constructive dialogue. There's nothing to be had there. The next fallacy in the ad hominem is actually a different type of ad hominem. It's called a contextual ad hominem. A contextual ad hominem. So the first one's an abusive ad hominem. The second one is a contextual ad hominem. This is when you attack a category or organization that a person is part of.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, and I don't generally get political, but I'm going to use some semi-political statements here. So, an example of this would be, well, you're a Republican, so of course you're in favor of guns, right? That's attacking the person's political party. That has nothing. Again, especially if you're not actually talking about gun control, that has no bearing on the discussion at hand. And on the other side, you could say like, well, you're a Democrat, so of course you're in favor of Social Security, right? Which I'm not sure those two are like really on the same level, but we're using talking points here.
Yeah. You're a
So
smoker. Of course, you're in favor of smelling bad.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
contextual and straight up ad hominem, right? Because I'm telling
yeah,
them that
exactly. Yeah, that's like that's a double whammy. Yeah, and other things like for example, saying like, well, you're of a particular religious group, so I'm not going to talk to you, or you're of a particular sexual orientation, so you must be wrong, anything like that, or you're of a particular ethnicity, so any conclusion. All of those are ad hominem contextuals. You're attacking the category that a person belongs to, or an organization that a person belongs to.
You are a car salesman, so.
Ooh, yeah. So you must lie.
Yeah, Johnny and I both used to sell cars at
Yes.
the same dealer.
Yeah, we did. We did. So yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, we're both liars. Don't trust anything we're saying.
Oh man. Yeah, so that's absolutely an ad hominem, a contextual ad hominem, where you are attacking the context of the person. And again, there might be certain characteristics that, not characteristics, there might be certain categories that a person belongs to that will affect how receptive other people are of them. So for example, if you are a car salesman, people might be, and I mean, I've certainly experienced this when I was selling cars. People are very hesitant to believe anything you say, and they automatically assume that you're going to try and cheat them out of their life earnings. Which in our case, I would say is not true. But
No.
I've certainly met and worked with people for whom that's true. But again, that's not relevant to the particular argument at hand. From a logical perspective, obviously from an efficacy perspective, it very much can come into play, and it very much can determine a person's opinion about a given argument. Again, same thing with ad hominem abusive, just don't do it. Don't attack a person's category, don't attack a person's organization that they're part of. That, again, one, just from like a rhetorical perspective, it's going to make a person defensive. Like, just, again, talking about efficacy, that's not a way to try and convince someone. You're going to be heightening their fight or flight response. We talked about it in a different video. You're going to be insulting them, which doesn't generally work very well. So just, again, don't do it. And if someone does start doing it, again, clearly they're not interested in engaging in a genuine discussion. And
I would say with the contextual, and you can correct me if I'm if I'm wrong, but if somebody is attacking, like, I was a missionary, so if
sure,
somebody saying like, oh, you missionaries, all you care about is making people Christians, um, then I wouldn't necessarily shy away from that conversation. It's not that they're unopen to it. In my perspective, and this might just be other rhetoric ideas coming in, I would agree with them and then give examples to strengthen their perspective, and then give examples as to why I am separate and different from those. And that's probably just a rhetorical technique, but
sure, absolutely. And I mean that would depend on kind of what your goal is, I guess, at that point. I would say like
obviously I was a missionary.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I would say if your goal at that point is to engage the person, I would assume this is actually probably a face-to-face conversation. I'm not sure how effective that might be online. Again, I'm not saying it's not effective. When I say I don't know, I tend to actually mean I don't know. Um, um, yeah, absolutely. From a rhetorical perspective, engaging a person and subverting their understanding of that category can absolutely be effective, giving them something that they're not expecting. And yeah, from a rhetorical perspective, affirming someone's opinion tends to make them feel more at ease, makes them feel more heard, and that does definitely lead to people being more receptive. Now, I'd say there's certainly, like with the missionary category, there's certainly room there for conversation. But I can think of several categories where someone starts attacking, like saying, "Oh, well, you're a person of color, so I'm going to disregard whatever you say." Like that's clearly, at that point, I don't think like engaging in kind of subversion
Yeah,
is going to be
that's,
particularly effective. So
I've kind
no,
of
yeah,
I've
go
kind of
ahead.
latched on to the organization perspective because
Yeah,
that's what my master's in, is organizational communication, and so it's like, oh, fun, let's do that, and I've kind of explored the category, which is
sure,
further.
absolutely. Well, and again, like I do think that's kind of a case by case basis, and I would say most of these kind of rhetorical strategies are going to work better person to person. Um, but yeah, I would say all of this stuff, all of the advice that we give, especially when it comes to rhetoric and engaging people, that's up to your personal um, preference. If you do want to engage a person, be like, hey, no, you're right. I've met missionaries who are, who confirm your biases, but here are all these other missionaries who, and like, citing specific examples. Yeah, I'd say rhetorically, that's a good way to bypass some of their prejudices.
Yeah. But that's not anything to do with the kernel of logic, which is the heart
Exactly.
of this topic.
Yep. Exactly.
So sorry for the red of derailing a conversation.
No, this is, again, like that's kind of the point of this. We get to talk stuff out. The next one is actually, it's one that really frustrates people, and it's really funny. As like a logic teacher, when I explain to my students, because my students think it means one thing, and I'm like, no, it means the opposite of what you think it means. So, calling someone out for being a hypocrite is a logical fallacy.
Hmm.
It's called a to quote fallacy. A to quote fallacy, which means you as well. You too.
TUQUO.
TU and the new word. Oh gosh. Again, I'm not a Latin expert. I have not taken Latin. I know tiny bits of Latin from reading classic literature. So it's TU, new word, QUOQUE, to quote.
And that you
And
also?
that means you also are you too. You as well. And when you point out that so basically a two quote fallacy is when you're pointing out that someone doesn't follow their own advice or doesn't follow their own logic. And this is one that is very frustrating to people, because being a hypocrite is not actually bad logic. Okay, it's certainly bad rhetoric, right? It certainly affects how receptive people are to your argument, but it does not actually change the content of what you're saying in that particular argument. Now, the example I always give in class is, say, and I clarify to students, I was like, Mr. Gratz would never do this. Mr. Gratz would get fired if I did this, right? But if I went into class and I had a big old cigar, right, and I lit the cigar in front of my students, I started smoking it, and I said, kids, don't smoke. It increases your risk of heart disease. It increases your risk for a variety of cancers. It increases your risk for a variety of skin conditions. It gives you bad breath. It makes your teeth turn yellow, so you shouldn't smoke. And if a student then says, but Mr. Grazza, you're smoking, I'll be like, that's a two quote fallacy. Because, again, they're not wrong, and it would certainly undermine my message if I was actively working or demonstrating behavior I was speaking out against. But my behavior, or whether I not follow my own advice, again, has no effect on that kernel of logic. Right? All those things I listed about smoking are true. Those are actual consequences to smoking. Whether or not I'm actively smoking while I talk about it doesn't change those facts.
That's a fun one.
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, like I said, obviously, if I was doing that, I'd be a very jobless teacher. I'd also be a very ineffective role model for my students if I'm trying to get them to exhibit behavior that I myself am not following. So obviously, it's very important from a rhetorical perspective, from a credibility perspective, or as we say in the biz, an ethos perspective, to make sure that you aren't being hypocritical. Right? That's going to make people more likely to listen to your advice. But from a logical perspective, it doesn't matter if you follow your own advice or your own argument or not.
Nifty. That's fun.
Yeah. And again, as with all of them, just don't do this, right? From a rhetorical perspective, and if you are engaging in debate and someone doesn't follow their own logic, or someone is applying their logic inconsistently, that's actually a very effective way to weaken an opponent's argument, to point out that it's logically inconsistent. So this is one where, like I say, don't do it. This is the one where, depending on the situation, you can do it. Yeah. And as far as, let's say, someone calls you out on a two quote, I'd say the best way to deal with it would be to again, wanting to maintain credibility, would be to recognize it and reevaluate your argument for consistency, and thinking about how your message is affected by your behavior.
Yep. A fun way to remember this is people that are woke but still do wrong things. They're too woke.
Excellent. Perfect. That's awesome. So next up, we have the last ad fontem argument that we're going to be talking about. And this is called the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy. And this has to do with kind of the root word of genetics, which is genesis, which, Zach, do you know what genesis means?
The beginning.
Very good. So the genetic fallacy is similar to the ad hominem fallacies in that it's attacking the character of the source, but it's a little bit further removed than attacking the actual speaker. So with a genetic fallacy, you aren't attacking the person giving the argument, you're attacking the original source of the argument. So for example, let's say Zach and I were having a debate and you brought up a research study from a particular scientist. And I
We'll
say,
call it Sally.
okay, yeah, Sally. So Sally is a scientist who did a study on, let's say, I don't know,
Attentiveness.
yeah, attentiveness. Awesome. And you bring up that study, and I've read that study, and I'm like, oh, okay, Zach, you can't use Sally because she's in prison for embezzling funds, right? That's true, and again, like we talked about, that can certainly affect the efficacy of your message, right? Using a source with that reputation, but it doesn't change the methodologies that Sally used to run her study, the sample size that Sally used to run her study, or any of that information. That's unaffected by it.
That makes sense. Uh, so really, if Sally was a good scientist, then there's no reason not to use her science.
Exactly.
Cool. Simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I do that one
Okay.
now? Or am I still
What?
not allowed to use that one?
Again, this can be somewhat effective, but I would still recommend not using it, because if the information is good, then the information is good. And that is, as far as like deconstructing an opponent's argument, if their arguments are using good information and good methodology, then the other information doesn't matter as far as the point they're trying to make. Now, if you're arguing about, the importance of character in research, but then at that point it's not irrelevant to the topic.
Cool. Is that all, or are we going to do another one?
That is all for the ad fontem. And do you want to dive into the next subcategory, red herring?
Kinda. How long have we been going for now? I don't know either. Let's do it. Why not?
Okay, let's go. We can edit that out if we need.
No, I like it. We'll keep it in. It's beautiful. We're
Okay,
real people
awesome.
too.
It's true. It's true. Okay, so the next subcategory is the red herring subcategory. Now, this subcategory, as we've talked about, red herrings, it's about distracting from the main point. So some of the terms that we often hear associated with it is derailing a person's train of thought. And that's kind of what red herrings do. Red herrings are distracting from the argument. They are often used when intentionally employed and maliciously employed. They can be used to try and kind of trip someone up. They can be used to make a person forget what they were talking about. But sometimes they happen where it's just you bring up something random that is just generally irrelevant from the core discussion, and it actively distracts from that core discussion. So the first one that we're actually going to, do you have a question?
I was going to say, I bet children would do the red herring a lot because.
Oh, sure. Especially in class. All the time. Like I'm about to start class and like a student will be like, hey, did you hear the newest Star Wars rumor? I'm like, I know what you're trying to do, and it will work. So, yeah, it's great. So the first red herring that we're going to be talking about, and this is one that can, depending on the intention behind it, can actually be categorized differently. And actually, the way I've developed to avoid it actually helps clarify the intention behind it. So this is one that happens very frequently, and this is one that's actually very important for people to know about. And this is called the straw man argument.
I heard that term, specifically
Yes.
in the Wizard of Oz.
So it's not actually referencing that. So the basically a straw man argument is when you present a weaker version of someone's argument and you beat that argument and you kind of pretend like you beat the original argument. Right? And so this is one that can often happen accidentally. And in that case, it's a miscommunication. It's a fallacy of clarity. But it often happens intentionally. So the kind of analogy I bring in for this is, let's imagine for a moment that I was in wicked good shape, and not only that, but I'm like a trained MMA fighter, right? Let's assume I'm not. I'm very much not an MMA fighter, but let's assume that.
He's a lover, not a fighter.
And let's assume that an overzealous fan made a scarecrow version of me, so a straw version of this, 6'8", swole, I believe the term is, MMA fighter. Okay, and then so there's me, and there's a straw man scarecrow version of me. Which one would you rather fight?
You, because I like challenges.
Right? No, generally speaking, people are going to go for the worse argument or the bad copy of the original, because it's going to be easier to beat, and it's going to make your audience seem like you've beaten this really intense argument, but you really haven't actually defeated it, because you are not engaging the actual argument itself. You're engaging a copy of it, a simulacrum, or a bad version of it. And I see this happen very regularly in political spheres. And I'm not just talking about politicians. Yes, politicians strawman each other all the time, very regularly. It's amusing to watch, especially once you kind of attune your ear to it, how like politicians talk about the same thing and they're like clearly misrepresenting the opponent's side on it. It's fascinating. But I also see this happen kind of from lay people, where and this is where I'm not always sure if it's intentional or if it's because they've internalized the bad argument that their favorite politician has given them. Right? So a politician will strawman an argument, give a bad version of it, and say like, "Oh, isn't this like the most ridiculous idea ever?" And then the people who listen to that politician will repeat it, and it's still a strawman argument. Right? It's still a weaker version of the original argument. Right. And they'll be like, "Oh, like how could anyone agree with this argument?" And then we kind of get into ad fontem territory, where you call people idiots for agreeing with an argument that you've misrepresented. But that happens fairly regularly. And so when it happened, so that's something to be on the lookout for. So if someone is saying like, "Hey, this one person is making this argument," check the original source. Right? Check to see what the actual argument is, so you can engage it honestly. But sometimes this genuinely happens on accident, where you're having a discussion and you misunderstand something that someone said. And so what you understand is a weaker version of their argument, and it's not intentional. So I've kind of come up with, sorry, go ahead.
Doesn't understand the actual argument themselves.
Exactly.
And accidentally put forth a weaker argument.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They relay a worse argument. Absolutely.
Yeah. In my master's program, I could think of an instance where another student misunderstood something and then put forth the misunderstood idea. And it would be like, if that were a debate or something, it would be fun to accept the bad argument that they put forth, even though I know better, because we learned it. We were in this together. They just, zoned out or something, and then beat them up with that. Is that ethical to do?
No. So again, and this is why. So I've kind of come up with a 4-step process to kind of help you determine how to move forward when you encounter a straw man argument. So the first step in the process is to summarize the argument, then repeat it back to the person. So summarize what you understood and repeat it back to the person. Then ask them if that's what they meant.
That's
if they say Yeah, well, if they say yes, awesome. There's been no straw man fallacy. You've avoided a fallacy of clarity. If they say no, then you clarify as needed. That's when you go back and you're like, okay, so where did I misunderstand you?
Cool.
And so if it's a malicious straw man argument, one, if the malicious straw man argument is that person who's repeating it back to you, you'll be able to catch them and be like, oh, no, nope, that's not what I said. Don't misrepresent what I said. If someone is strawmanning an argument that you said, you can say like, hey, that's not an accurate representation of the argument. Although again, if people are actively, intentionally, maliciously engaging in strawman arguments, it's not really worth the conversation, because you're not going to be dealing on equal footing. You're not going to be able to present your argument in its best form because they won't accept it as that. So again, once people start intentionally reverting to strawman fallacies, in my opinion, there's not a whole lot of use in engaging in that conversation anymore.
Cool.
But if it's a genuine accidental misunderstanding of an argument, or they think they understand the argument and it turns out they don't, then going through that kind of 4-step process where you summarize it, you repeat it back to them, and then ask if that's what they meant, clarify as needed, that really helps clear up any miscommunication. And then just always, if you hear, secondhand that, hey, so and so said this, check the original source.
Yeah.
Like, that's, especially in this day of information, that's super easy.
Yeah. The one thing I think would be beneficial to talk about, not right now, but in another instance, maybe when we get towards rhetoric and or
Mm-hmm.
something, but the you mentioned not engaging past the strawman argument, but I think one issue that like a lot of people fall into is you can't walk away because that's a blow to your pride, and that means that you don't know and that you're admitting that you can't win that, when really
Yep.
it's simply it's better to walk away and have that. And so I think that would be a topic for a later date of the setting aside your pride in an argument or your feelings and letting people think less of you, like letting the person that already
Sure.
thinks a little of you think less of you because it doesn't matter anyway.
Absolutely.
Maybe
And that's very important. And that again comes down to the motivation of getting into argument. We'll have a whole video on, you know, or at least we should do a whole video on just like when there's a point to getting into an argument, and like, what you're talking about, being able to personally be like, you know what, I don't care about this person's opinion, so walking away is no skin off my nose. But again, like that motivation for getting into the debate, I always tell my students, we debate to learn, right? Ultimately, if I'm engaging in a conversation with someone, I'm debating them so that I can learn more about the topic as well. And the whole iron sharpens iron concept.
Yeah.
And I really try to emphasize this for my students, that we debate to win, or we debate to we debate to learn, not to win. And then I have a fallacy of clarity that happens there, and they now think that they have to win. I'm kidding. No, we debate to learn, not to win. That's a straw man fallacy.
On my chest.
Excellent. That'd be awesome.
It's gonna have your quote underneath, JG.
Nice. The next red herring is what's called an appeal to ignorance. An appeal to ignorance. And this is a fascinating one. There can be a variety of ways that it manifests, but generally it can be kind of encompassed in the saying, absence of proof is not proof of absence, or kind of the inverse of that. So an appeal to ignorance, it's basically when you're using an absence of information to come to a conclusion. Right. So whether or not this is, to use a fairly common one, I have not seen any proof that God exists, therefore God does not exist, right? For a variety of logical reasons, that conclusion does not follow from that premise, right? You can't conclude from no information that something doesn't exist. On the inverse or converse, inverse, whatever,
Converse.
another
Come on.
another way that people will sometimes use this is to say, well, no one's ever disproven that Bigfoot exists, therefore Bigfoot exists, right? So again, like no one's, you also can't prove a negative in that particular sense. But that's kind of setting up an impossible evidentiary requirement. So it's creating an impossible bar to surpass, and it literally brings nothing to the discussion. It's kind of an empty statement. And these types of things, saying like, "Oh, well, you can't prove it, so it doesn't exist." These things are often used as a way to kind of derail and to distract from main arguments. When you're not bringing up any evidence, you're not bringing up an actual argument, you're saying empty words that don't mean anything in any meaningful manner.
I imagine that one can be easy to fall into.
Sure.
And yeah.
And this
Like
is actually one. Oh, go ahead.
In the academic world, like one of the things that I ran into, I wanted to study a particular, very specific segment of communication, and there hasn't been any research on it. But like at a master's level, I can't do my own. That would be like a doctoral thesis type
Study.
project, and so because I couldn't do the evidence, I don't have the evidence at hand. I can't say that the answer to that thesis statement is no, because there's no evidence to test it.
And you also can't say yes, right? No evidence is literally no evidence. You can't draw a conclusion from no evidence, which is kind of what's at the heart of an appeal to ignorance. So it's when you're appealing to a lack of evidence as evidence for the existence or non-existence of something, which is silly. But this is actually one that we kind of do have a constructive way to avoid, and that is find evidence. Use actual supporting evidence in your argument instead of drawing on a lack of evidence.
Makes sense.
Okay, now the next two, and these are going to be the last two or not irrelevant thesis. Oh, well, that's one of them that we're talking about. This is going to be the last red herring. These are actually kind of inextricably connected, and whether you're committing one or the other really depends on the context. So this is a paired one, and it's called an irrelevant goal or an irrelevant thesis.
Goal or thesis?
Yep, irrelevant goal or an irrelevant thesis. Again, these names are somewhat self-explanatory. An irrelevant goal is when in an argument you bring up a goal that is irrelevant to what's being discussed. So you bring up kind of a benchmark, a bar, or a goal that is just not part of the discussion. Whereas with an irrelevant thesis, you're bringing up evidence that is irrelevant to the discussion. And the reason I say that this one kind of depends on context, it's mostly because, I try to really simplify the concepts for my 7th graders, and it's not the easiest thing to test for. But if I said apples have sugar in them, so teachers should be paid more, is that an irrelevant goal or an irrelevant thesis?
That would be a relevant thesis because you presented evidence of, well, no, it wasn't apple. You don't present any evidence that sugar is in apples.
Well, I mean, that's a fact. Oh, that is evidence.
Well, So I was right about it being a thesis?
No, because what if we're talking about sugar levels in apples?
I thought we were talking about teachers being paid more.
Well, again, that's an assumption you made.
I think we need some clarity in this.
Right. So again, like on its own, that sentence, you can't determine if it's an irrelevant thesis. So if the apple and sugar fact is irrelevant, or if the goal of paying teachers more is irrelevant. Because if you're talking about teacher pay, then the thesis, the evidence is irrelevant. If you're talking
Right.
about, sugar levels in apples, then what does teacher pay have to do with that? So this is one of those where, you have to look at the broader
Oh, I know,
argument.
because you give teachers apples as gifts.
That's still irrelevant. But so again, you don't know whether it's an irrelevant thesis or an irrelevant goal unless you have the context of the larger argument. So normally you will have that context. So if all of a sudden, you know, and this is where, again, I'm going to be mildly political, where let's say we're talking about the U.S. COVID-19 numbers, right? Our infection rate. We're talking about how we could or could not be doing things better in the U.S., the efficacy of the different systems that we've put in place. And if someone says, well, let's look at another country's number, well, that's not necessarily relevant to how we could be doing things better. Right? You can certainly try and look for analogies or look at systems that are leading to those better numbers, right? But just all of a sudden saying, well, so and so other country has it worse. It's like, yes, you're not wrong, but we're trying to improve our situation. And this is where we come into whataboutism, which is something we talked about in a previous video. Whataboutism is kind of it's either going to be an irrelevant goal or an irrelevant thesis. And oftentimes it's going to be an irrelevant thesis. So when we kind of couch this in political terms. If a politician is saying, is currently dealing with some kind of a scandal, and they're like, well, this other politician did something equally as bad. Maybe. They may not be wrong. It's possible it might be true, right? But that's not what we're discussing. And we've especially seen that over the last few months with, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement. I think is actually a fantastic example of this, where people will say Black Lives Matter, and then the response is all lives matter.
All lives matter. And
it's like, well, yes, but that's not what we're talking about, right? Yeah. That's irrelevant to the discussion at hand. Or I've had several discussions with people. Well, they'll be like, well, there's also rampant anti-Semitism in the U.S., and it's like, yes, there is. That's awful and that's terrible. That doesn't detract from the Black Lives Matter movement. Like those they're not mutually exclusive. Or bringing up, for example, that there's a larger wage gap and there's a larger wealth gap with indigenous peoples. It's like, you're not wrong. That's a true fact, but that is not what we're currently discussing. Now, we need to be discussing about all those things. We need to have a discussion about all those things, absolutely. But when we're specifically talking about what's happening in the U.S. with like the Black Lives Matter movement, that's intentionally trying to distract, right? It's intentionally trying to derail or change the narrative to something else. And I think that's a really, really excellent example of an irrelevant thesis.
Cool. That's a good one. And that's under the context of red herring?
Yep, that's a red herring. It's distracting from the core argument.
Cool.
Yep.
Nifty. Is that everything?
That is the first two subcategories of fallacies of relevance. And we'll cover the larger category, which is appeals to emotion, the last category of fallacies of relevance, in our next video.
Woo! I got a red herring magic trick. Do you want to see it?
I do. Let's see it.
Okay, so I'm going to tilt the camera a bit. So imagine that all of these are red herrings. Pick a red herring.
That one, that red herring.
This one or that one?
That one. Yep.
That one. Okay.
Yep.
Let's check out the red herring.
Okay.
Okay. And now, because we drew attention to the fallacies that happen with red herrings, it's going to magically change into not a logical fallacy because now we know
So
what to look
we're
out for.
self-reflective, right?
We're self-reflecting right now. And now let's see if we can spot the red herring that was just used. I don't know. Oh, that's different because
Oh
we talked
man.
about it, right? Is that
Oh,
the
there it
one?
is. That was the one.
Wow.
That's actually a really
Red.
good metaphor for self-reflective, the benefits of self-reflection and logic.
Well, there you go. Oh,
That's
for
awesome.
anybody who's listening and not watching, I just did an awesome magic trick.
Yeah, we're trying to figure out how that'll translate to if we turn this into an audio podcast.
So
That's
I'm going to run
redundant.
through. Yeah, it's fine. I'm going to run through the recap real quick.
Awesome.
Correct me if I get anything wrong.
Oh, but
We're
wait,
looking
did
at.
you hear?
Oh,
Did you hear about that one political scandal that just happened?
hey, you're trying to derail my train of thought. That's a red herring.
Excellent.
And besides, that's not even the biggest one. What about the other guy? But
Yeah, but breaking news.
Oh.
There's more.
So we're looking specifically at fallacies of relevance, and then
Yep.
specifically the subcategory of ad phantom, and those subcategories of that. It means at the source, and plain and simple, we shouldn't do them, such as the ad hominem, which attacks the character of the speaker. Then there is contextual ad hominem, which attacks something that the speaker is associated with. And then there's the genetic fallacy, which attacks not the speaker, but the original source of what the speaker is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the too woke fallacy, because I am too woke, and I am a hypocrite. And that doesn't matter if I'm being a hypocrite, because it still doesn't change the fact of the logic. Did I miss any of the ad phantoms?
Nope, that's all the ad phantom.
Red herring is a distraction from the main point. And straw man argument, it can be malicious or it can be accidental, but either way, it's not a good thing to do. It's a bad copy of the original, hence the name straw man. You build a fake example and then you knock it down because straw men don't fight back. And the simplest solution to that is to go to the original source and check it out. And if you encounter a straw man, summarize what you heard, repeat it back to them, and ask if that's what they meant. And that breaks down the straw man. And if it's not what they meant, then clarify as needed. And remember, folks, you debate to learn, not to win. JG.
Hey, you got it right.
And then there's the appeal then there's the appeal to ignorance, which simply put is the absence of proof. You can't draw a conclusion from a lack of evidence. And then there's a relevant goal or thesis, and that depends on the context of what is being said. It's not relevant to the discussion. Either the goal that you're trying to reach or the evidence that you're bringing up isn't relevant. How'd I do?
Awesome. Yeah, that's good. I think that's everything.
Wow, that was a fun episode.
That was a fun episode. That was a long episode.
Great. Was it?
I think so.
I don't know.
I lost all sense of time.
And you're still watching. Thanks for watching.
Yeah.
We are the logic. We are the logic magicians. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, thanks for watching, folks. We'll see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Bye.
Bye.